welcome to another video. Today it is the McCalls 7810 sew along. As you've noticed, I'm doing things a little differently with the sew alongs and I am putting them into one single video, hopefully with chapters if I can work out how to do it. This will hopefully give you the chance to listen to the review first and then go through the different chapters to the part of the sew along that you are looking for. It should also make going backwards and forwards throughout the sew along easier as well. Say for example, if you want to go over a point, you can just go to the beginning of that chapter. Hopefully I can work out how to do them. So I'm going to give you my pattern review first and then we'll jump into the sew along. Now the McCalls 7810 is a top that was voted for by the Patreon peeps, and you're going to be seeing a whole long list of names going across the screen now. I put up 4 different patterns, top patterns for the vote, and this is the one that won, and I was really excited about it because I thought, you know what, this is going to be something that actually I really like. I like that it's got a waist seam, I like the V-neck, I like all the different options they have for the peplum, either fitted or flared. Then I kind of concentrated on the picture of the lady wearing the top, view A, on the envelope, and I suddenly got the fear that actually, you know what, this is an empire line top, and if that's the case, only the fitted peplum is going to be for me, not the flared ones. And then I got even more of the fear about it, and I ended up, I think this one's been outstanding for about 18 months now, so I'm really glad that I finally got to this one. However, I don't think this top is for me, and if you guys have been watching any of the waffles, you will know that I have realised that grown on sleeves like this are just not for me, and it's because I end up with so much fabric here, and it just is the same for dresses, shirts and coats. I have made all of these things with grown on sleeves. The only exception is the by hand London Anna dress, because the little sleeves they're just cap sleeves rather than longer, and possibly if I shorten the sleeves on this to cap sleeve length I might like it more, but I don't. I think this is a nice top, don't get me wrong, I do think this is a nice top. I just don't think it's a great top on me. I think I have things in my wardrobe like my McCalls 6563 woven t-shirt for example, which also has little cap grown on sleeves, but I think that looks better on me than this does. I think that this doesn't quite work the way that I wanted it to, and you know what, it actually probably would look better like it does on the lady with an empire line with the seam coming under my bust rather than at my waist. However, I don't like it enough that I am going to go back and retrace it and make those alterations to it, because I just don't think this is the top for me. When I featured this on the Daily Waffles, I had lots and lots of suggestions from different people saying that I should try that. I should try and sew the pleats under the bust down a little bit more. I should crop the sleeves. They're all really good suggestions, but as I say, I just don't love the basic block, the beginning of this top, enough to make the tweaks to it to get it to a point that it's something that I'm okay with. So I won't be revisiting this pattern and I won't be doing any of the tweaks and things like that. I made this out of a super lightweight rayon challis or viscose challis, and there are 2 layers in the top because the bodice is fully lined, the peplum is just 1 layer. I think the way the pattern has you put the lining in is daft. If you're going to put a lining in something, then sandwich the zip inside of it and tuck the lining under and, you know, clean finish things on the inside. Basically this hat pattern has you put it together to finish off this front with a nice finished neckline, which is great, but then it kind of treats it as if it's one piece of fabric, as if you've interlined it, and I just think that's a bit daft. If you're going to line something, you know, take advantage of the lining and sandwich the zipper in. As I've said, I deviate from the pattern that way, and I will show you how I put the lining in so that the zip inside is enclosed. And again, that's just a personal preference of mine. It's not something that you have to do, it's just something that I have done, and I will show you how I've done it. The other thing as well is the instructions for finishing off the V neckline. They would have you put your needle down and pivot, which is a valid way of doing it. It's just a really difficult way to make it end up with a really nice clean finish in this area, so I show you a slightly different way, which is just finishing back tacking at the pivot point, moving all the seam allowance out of the way, and then starting your stitching again from the other side, rather than trying to meet a pivot point with all the seam allowance folded down where it should be and pivot there and try. It's doable, it is doable. I just find that this is a much quicker way of getting a cleaner finish, so I'll talk you through that as well. As I say, this pattern was voted for by the Patreon peeps, and I'm really glad that they did choose this one out of the patterns that were available. It's something outside of my comfort zone, it's something a little bit different for me, and I'm glad that I've tried it because it has given me the realisation that grown on sleeves and pleats this low or gathers this low under the bust are just not for me. This would be much more flattering if there was, like I say, an empire line and the pleats were coming from there, and then there was a midriff panel and then a peplum, or if the straight up and down peplum just came from the empire line rather than from my waist. For a 42-year-old, I have nice boobs, and this top makes me look like my boobs are around my waist, and they're not. So yeah, I don't think this is the top for me. Having said that, I have done the full sew along for making this top, and I do talk you through a few different techniques, as I've mentioned, in my opinion, finishing the lining a little bit better and also getting a clean finish on a V-neck, a V-point like this. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, I have separated this into chapters, so you should be able to skip ahead to certain chapters to see how I've done those things if you are interested in that particular part. Or there's the sew along in total, right from tracing the pattern through to finishing it up with hand stitching the lining into place. So let's get started. So the first thing you want to do is iron your pattern tissue paper so that you can get an accurate trace from your pattern. Even if you're cutting your pattern out, iron it first just so that it's easier to cut out or trace from. I trace my patterns because in the UK, big four patterns like this, I mean all patterns, indie included, they are expensive. I do get them from the US whenever they are on sale and I can get free shipping, but they are still pricey items, so I like to trace them to maintain the original pattern tissue if I want to come back to it at a different time. This has been especially useful recently because I have put on some weight and some of my patterns that I've traced previously are now too small for me, and if I'd cut them out I wouldn't have the larger sizes available. So I'm very glad that By Hand London got me into the tracing my patterns shtick, but again, that's just something that I like to do. I know a lot of people don't, so you do you. So the first thing that we need to do is work out what size we're going to trace. Now, the back of the envelope has all of the sizes along here. So according to this, I'm between a 16 and an 18 for the bust because my bust measures 39 inches. I'm a 14 for the waist. My waist is 28 inches. And then my hips, I'm between a 20 and a 22 because my hips at the moment are 45 inches wide. Now you'll probably notice I have the 6 to 14 pattern size bundle, which means that only one of those measurements I should only be able to fit into one of those measurements according to the envelope. As you guys know, there is usually a lot of wearing ease built into these patterns, so I'm actually going to go by the finished garment measurements which are printed on the pattern tissue. You will usually find the bust measurement around the bust on the front of the bodice, and the waist is usually around the waistline on the front of the bodice as well. Sometimes this can be on the midriff, but it's usually if there's room for it, it's usually on the bodice pieces. So according to the pattern, I should be doing a between 16 and an 18 for the bust. So the largest we have here is a size 14, which gives a 42-inch finished garment measurement, and the size 14 is for a 36. So that's 6 inches of wearing ease. Okay, 6 inches of wearing ease. And then again, so I am a size 14, 28-inch waist. The 14 on here is a 31-inch finished measurement for the waist. That's 3 inches of wearing ease. And again, I don't believe that from that picture. I am going to go with the size 12, which is a 40-inch finished measurement, which will give me between an inch and an inch and a half of wearing ease, and a size 12, which is a 29 finished measurement for the waist, and that's going to give me an inch and a half wearing ease at the waist as well, because my waist is fluctuating, but it's around about 27.5 to 28 inches. So I'm going to be doing an all over size 12. So I'm just going to note that down. There aren't any measurements on the peplum pieces for the hips. I'm hoping I'm going to get away with this. We shall see. For views C and D, I won't need to worry about the measurements. I can't decide if I'm going to put the waist ties on. I'm not going to put the sleeve flounces on because I don't like the sleeve flounces. I do really like this clean look, and this will be much easier to tuck into tops, but I do like the bow at the front here, and I'm probably going to go for view A thinking about it. This is finishing on her high hip, so I don't need to worry about my hip measurements, I hope. We shall see. As I say, this part here is supposed to be on her waist, which I think is here. So it's going to be interesting to see how this actually turns out, because this is definitely an Empire line top on her. It looks beautiful, it looks really beautiful, but it's just not what they're telling, it's not what the pattern says I'm going to get. So the next thing that I like to do is go through the top and make a note of the pattern pieces that I want to trace. So I'm going to definitely be doing size 12, and I'm going to be doing number 1, which is the front. Number 2 is the tie, and I am going to trace it, but I probably won't do it for this particular make, but I like it and I may want to do it for future makes, so I'd rather trace it now than have to iron the pattern pieces flat again, get it out and trace it later, if you get what I mean. Number 3, the back, definitely going to need that. Number 4 is the sleeve flounce. I'm not going to do that because I just don't like that look on me, so I'm not going to ever want the sleeve flounce. Number 5 is front peplum for A and B. I'm going to need that. Number 6 is back peplum for A and B. I'm going to want that. Next we've got the peplum front for C, which is the elongated peplum here. I am going to trace that because I may want to make that in the future. We've then got piece 8, which is the back for the peplum for C and D. I'm going to trace that. And then we've got piece 9, which is the front peplum for the high-low hem, as it were, for this one. So I am going to trace that. So the only piece I'm not tracing is number 4. As I go through and trace my pattern pieces, I will cross them off this list just so that I don't forget to trace a particular piece. Ask me how I know, this has happened in the past. So now that I have worked out what size I'm going to trace and which pattern pieces I'm going to trace, I'm going to get that done, and then I'll come back and show you the alterations I want to make. Okay, so as I mentioned, I have crossed off the numbers as I have traced the pieces out. I'm now going to go through and sort out the pieces I need for the top that I'm going to make and the pieces that I need to alter. So we've got the peplum back and peplum front for C, I don't need those. Peplum front and back for A and B, I do need those. Peplum front and peplum back for D, I don't need those. This is the bodice front, so I will need that. Bodice back, and then the tie piece. So I'm going to fold up all the pieces that I don't need and put those aside, and then for the bodice front and back I will need to lengthen them, so I've marked in the lengthen and shorten line on both pieces, so I will get that done and I will show you how I do that next. Okay, so I am going to be lengthening my bodice pieces by 1 inch. This is a standard alteration that I have to do for the McCalls, Vogue and Butterick patterns to make them actually sit on my natural waist. There's a lengthen and shorten line across here along the back piece, and then it's here along the front piece. You've seen me do this before if you've seen any of my other sew alongs. The important thing to do is make sure that there is a perpendicular line running through your lengthen and shorten line. This one we've got the grain line going through it. For the back piece we haven't got anything going through it, so I am just going to draw in a small perpendicular line, and that's just your registration line so you can line up your pattern pieces once you've cut them apart. I'm going to need some plain paper, which I have here, and I'm going to mark a rectangle that is 1 inch wide, or 2 parallel lines that are 1 inch apart, because I'm not going to draw the ends on to make it into a rectangle. Next we are going to cut through our lengthen and shorten line, and this is where that perpendicular line will come into play for making everything meet up. So we're going to cut through that. We're going to stick the cut edge of the bottom of the pattern piece along the bottom straight edge that we've drawn, and we're going to stick that down all the way along. And I'm trying to do this with the tripod in the way, so if I'm looking a little awkward it's because the tripod's right where I want to be. So now that I've stuck the bottom piece down, I'm going to mark a line up through from that registration line that we drew earlier, and this will mean that when I take my top of the pattern piece and I line the cut edge up along with the second line of our 1 inch wide box lines, parallel lines, we can match it up perfectly like that, and then we just need to true up the side seams. So there's not a lot of difference between those ones, and this one just curves out ever so slightly, and we want to get rid of that curve because, I mean, literally 1/16 of an inch I've taken off there. So I'm going to cut this piece out and do exactly the same for the bodice front, and I'm going to just shift this over slightly so that I can get at it easier, and I'll put it on a time lapse so you can see in a little bit more speed how it goes. Okay, so I've lengthened the back bodice and the front bodice, and we have our back peplum and front peplum here. So this is a nice and simple pattern. We're going to cut 2 of the front bodice and 2 of the back bodice out of the main fabric, 2 out of each of lining, and then 2 of the front peplum and 2 of the back peplum. That is the next step, get the fabric cut out. The pattern recommends a wool crepe, poplin or charmeuse. The wool crepe and the poplin would probably be the ones with the most body. The crepe and the charmeuse will both have a lot of drape to them. For lining, it just says lining fabrics. I've decided to use this royal blue rayon or viscose that I had 5 meters of. I've made a inside of a hunter tank from it. I've made a 6380 skirt from it, and I am now going to use it to make this top. It's going to be interesting filming this as a sew along because the right and the wrong side of this are pretty much exactly the same, but I will show you my tips and tricks how I deal with a fabric like that when I need to remember which is the right and which is the wrong side. So I'm going to get this fabric ironed, get it cut out, and then we can start sewing. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is make sure that all of our notches and pleat markers are transferred over to the fabric. So I have made holes into the tops of the pleats, and I have just snipped in to the bottoms of the pleats. I have laid my pattern piece over the fabric, and I have used my chalk marker because I'm working on a dark background, and I have literally just gone through the holes and put the little marks in like that, and then I have flipped it and repeated the process on the other side. When I work with a fabric like this that doesn't have an obvious right and wrong side, I like to mark it with a pin. So this is the wrong side of my outer fabric, and I have used orange pins for the wrong side of my lining fabric. The first step we have is stitch front sections together at centre front, ending stitching at small circle. On the pattern piece here there is a small circle which is basically 5/8 of an inch. It's the seam allowance in, so I'm going to mark that on all of my pieces, and I'm going to stitch the centre fronts together of the outer and the centre fronts together of the lining. I like to do all of the steps at the same time. The pattern actually has you make the outer and then make the lining separately, but because we're doing the same steps, I like to do them at the same time. And as I say, I have marked the lining with orange pins and the outer with white pins. So I'm going to get my front sections stitched together. Okay, so I have stitched the centre front of the outer and lining fabrics together up to the small circle. Next up, I'm not doing the version with the sash, so we now need to sew the front and back together at the shoulder seam and the underarm seam. So I'm going to do that for both my outer and lining fabric. Okay, so I've sewn the side seams together and the shoulder seams together. I've actually gone in and clipped the underarm seams here around the curve. It's not something that's mentioned in the pattern, but when you have a curve like this and you need to press it flat, this will help to make the curve press flat and lie nicely when it's turned through. So I'm not adding on the flounce to the sleeve. I am also not doing the slits in the top of the sleeve. If I like this top, I will want to do these in the future, but for now I am just doing a straight closed sleeve at the top. And I'm also going to finish my sleeve in a different way than the pattern suggests, so I'm not going to press under the seam allowance on the lining and the outer. So we are now up to step 17, which is with right sides together, pin lining to top at neck edge, stitch pivoting at small circle, trim understitch lining as far as possible. I'm actually going to skip ahead and I am going to mark the pleats and actually sew those into place, because at the moment I mean usually I would have done that as the very first step, but I thought I'd give it a try this way around. But I don't want to end up with basically two tops sewn together at the neckline that I'm trying to wrangle, so I'm going to sew the pleats in next. So it says to make pleats in front on outside, crease along lines of small circles, bring creases to lines of circles based across lower edge and press. I'm basically just going to be bringing the pleats, then the pleats are going to pleat into the center, so the fabric is going to fold over the top. I'm not actually going to baste the edges of the pleats together either. On the pattern you can see here that they are free, they're not sewn down, and I don't want any stitching lines in there, so I am just going to bring the pleats together along the bottom edge and baste those into place. So this is the pleat pattern that we're aiming for. We want the pleats to be going towards the centre front. You'll notice that I haven't pressed anything as yet because none of the seams that I have sewn have gone over each other, so I don't need to get up and press anything yet, but it will be the next step because when I sew the neckline together I will need to sew over this seam, so it needs to be flat. But as I mentioned, the pleats need to be pleating towards the centre front, and you need to have a look at the pattern pieces because the arrows on there will tell you the direction that the fabric needs to be pleated in. The other thing to bear in mind, especially if you're using my method for marking your pleats, which is just to snip into the ends of them, that there is also a notch here, so you don't want to pleat this bit together. Ask me how I know. You want to make sure that you are pleating the actual pleats together as you go. So I'm going, this is the lining, I'm going to do it with the outside fabric now, and I'm going to try and set you up so I can show you how I've done it. Okay, so along this bottom edge there are actually 7 notches. This first one here is the notch that will help us align the peplum with the top, and this is the first part of a pleat, and that's the second part of a pleat. So I want the fabric to be going, this is the right side up, as you can see here, there's my seam. So I want the fabric to be going over, and I'm taking this notch and I'm matching it up with the next notch along. And make sure that the raw edges all match up, and then I'm going to pin that into place. So at the moment you're looking at the wrong side of the fabric, which I appreciate. I have not picked the best fabric to do a sew along in because the right and wrong sides aren't overly obvious. So this is the right side, and as you can see the fabric is pleating towards the centre front. So there's the next notch, and there is its corresponding pleat. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm basically making the notches meet up like that, then making sure that the raw edge of the fabric is lining up, and then I'm going to pin that into place, and I'm going to pin the other end of that pleat as well, and it has overlapped ever so slightly with the first pleat that I made, which is what we want. So there's number 2, and then this is the last set of notches, so we've got 1 notch there and 1 notch there, and again bringing it so that the outer fabric is pleating towards the centre front. We're matching up the notches and then matching up the raw edges and pinning that all into place. And again, that pleat has overlapped. So I've got my 3 pleats facing towards the centre front. If you end up with your fabric looking different to this, you need to undo it all and repleat it so that you end up with the edges of your pleats pointing towards the centre front. So we're going to do the same on the other side, and again bear in mind that there is a notch over here that matches up the waistline to the peplum. So it's the next set of notches, and the first pleat is the biggest, and again we're bringing the fabric towards the centre, matching up the notches, matching up the raw edges of the waistline, seam, and pinning that in place. So that's our first pleat formed, and again the fabric is going towards the centre front. We've got our next notch meeting up with the next part of the pleat. So I'm going to bring those 2 together. And again make sure that the raw edge of the waist seam or the waistline is matching up, and again they're kind of overlapping, so I'm going to put that pin in there. So there's the second pleat, and then the final pleat, you can see there's my notch and there's my notch, so I'm bringing this notch over to this notch, again making sure that all my raw edges are lining up. I'm going to pin that one in place, and again it's overlapping ever so slightly with that second pleat that we made, so I'm going to pin that into place. And so now I have a nicely pleated centre front, so I'm going to run a line of basting stitches along here at 3/8 of an inch and then along here at 3/8 of an inch. I'm not going to go the whole way over because, as I mentioned, I haven't pressed this centre front seam yet, and I want to leave the seam allowance free so I can press it open and flat in a second. So I'm going to baste these into place, then we can go and press everything. Okay, so I have pressed all of my seams open now, and I have pinned my neck edge together. This is step 17. With right sides together, pin lining to top at neck edge, stitch pivoting at small circle, trim under stitch lining as far as possible. I agree with that all except for the pivoting at the small circle. I think when you have a centre front seam like this that you have left open above, then trying to hit and pivot at that particular point with the seam open is really difficult. So what I've done is I've put my pin through the small circle and I have matched it up with the other side at the small circle underneath all of that, so they are matching up perfectly. What I'm going to do is sew up to this point and back stitch, then I'm going to re-maneuver all of the seam allowance over and start sewing from the other side of the seam allowance up the other front edge. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to leave an inch of the neck edge at the back unstitched because I want to put my zip in differently to the pattern. I want to enclose it between the outer and lining fabric. It's a personal preference of mine, but it's not what the pattern would have you do. So I'm going to start my stitching an inch in. I'm going to stitch all the way to the center front, the small circle, and back stitch there. Then I'm going to take out all my pins, rearrange them, and start my stitching at the other side. For me, that just gives me a cleaner finish. It also means that I'm not trying to kind of make sure that everything lies nice and flatly and pivoting. It can get really messy really easy, and I find this a much easier way to get a clean finish. So I'm going to sew this at 5/8 of an inch, back stitch it there, and then repin and sew the other side at 5/8 of an inch, leaving an inch of the neck lining unsewn at the very ends, both sides. Okay, so as you can see, the seam allowances are still flying free, as it were, and I have stitched up to and back stitched either side of them. And when obviously it's not pressed yet, but when you turn this through, it just gives a much cleaner finish at this point. I am going to trim the seam allowances down just to make sure that there's less bulk in this area, but the next thing that we want to do is understitch the neckline as far as we can. We won't be able to get all the way into the points, but we should be able to get quite a nice way in. When you're understitching, you are stitching, you're opening up the seam that you've just done, and you are stitching the seam allowance to the lining side of the top. And because we are finishing, or because I'm finishing mine slightly differently, you want to start your understitching about an inch away from where the seam line stitching finished, so that you can get in here later and finish off this area once the zip is installed. So I'm going to make sure all of my seam allowances over to the lining, and I'm going to be stitching 1/8 of an inch away from my seam line, just securing all of the lining and seam allowance together, which will give a nice clean finish on the neck edge. Okay, I have understitched the neckline, as you can just about see there. I've also clipped the curves around the shoulder seam, so I'm now going to go and give that a press, and then we can finish off the armholes. Okay, so I have pressed the neck edge with the understitching. I have put the seams I've put the sleeves through, so we've got the outer here and then we have the inner fabric here. I have lined up the underarm seam. Now I'm going to bag this out because I don't mind slip stitching, there's nothing wrong with it, but I just find this is a quicker and cleaner method of finishing off your armholes, or armholes. So I'm going to, I haven't pressed anything, but I'm going to turn the outer under by the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then the lining under by the 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I am going to pin those together. Now you don't have to do this, but I personally have to do this because I cannot work out, I'll end up with a Mobius loop if I don't do this step first. So next we are going to reach inside of the top. So this is the outer, this is the lining, and we're going to reach in and I'm going to bring through the sleeves that I've just pinned together. So there's my pin there. So now what I'm going to do is take that pin out, but I'm going to make sure that I'm holding the pieces together the way that they were pinned. So I'm taking the pin out and then I'm lining up my underarm seam and I'm pinning that into place. So I'm going to go around and pin the rest of these sleeve openings, the ends of these sleeves, I'm going to pin them together, and once I have pinned them all together, I will be able to sew them at 5/8 of an inch. So I've got the shoulder seam here, so I'm going to pin that together first. I'm going to pin, just match up all the raw edges. It's a little fiddly, but you can get there. So I'm going to pin the shoulder seam together, and then, as I say, I'm going to pin the rest of the raw edges together the whole way around. So everything's pinned together and you will end up with something that looks like this. So this is one sleeve, this is the other sleeve. So it's kind of in a tube. So what we're going to do now, we're going to sew the arm openings together at 5/8 of an inch the entire way around. When we turn that out, it will have clearly finished the sleeve, the end of the sleeve, which will allow us to press it all flat, and fingers crossed we won't have a Mobius loop. So there is a way you can totally pin this together without doing that first step, but I have not yet been able to do that successfully without then making it so that I can't turn it right way around through. So for me, it's just easier having it wrong sides together, turning under the seam allowances and doing that initial pin, because I just can't get to this stage and get it right otherwise. So I'm going to sew this at 5/8 of an inch, turn it out, and I'll show you what it looks like. Okay, so I've sewn my sleeve together. Let's just hope after all that waffling that I have done it correctly. So I'm turning the garment the right side out. I should be able to reach in and find the edge that I've just sewn, which I can. So obviously this will need to be pressed, but that is a clean finish on the end of the sleeve. So yeah, it needs to be pressed, but that is cleanly finished. So I'm going to do exactly the same for the other side. Then we can start looking at making the peplum. Now that I've got all the sleeves finished, I need to work on the peplum. So we have 2 front pieces and 2 back pieces. These ones aren't lined, so I am going to sew the center front seam and the side seams with French seams, and I'm going to finish the back edge with bias binding. I'm going to start by pinning these together, wrong sides together, and sewing at 1/4 of an inch for the front seam and the 2 side seams. So I'm going to pin it together and show you what that looks like. So I've pinned the side seams together. I have marked the back seam, centre back seam, just whilst I was pinning everything together, because once you take the paper pattern pieces off, these all look very, very similar. I can remove this now. And I have already sewn the centre front seam together at 1/4 of an inch. So I'm going to do the same for the side seams, sew those together at 1/4 of an inch, then trim, press and re-sew to make the French seams. So as you can see, I've sewn my first seam at 1/4 of an inch. I am now trimming my seam allowance down to just under 1/8 of an inch so that I can press the wrong sides together and then re-sew at 3/8 of an inch to enclose the raw edges and finish my French seam. So I'm going to finish chopping this off, press and re-sew. I've trimmed the seam allowance down and pressed it so that the right sides are together. Trust me, these are the right sides. And I am now going to sew this at 3/8 of an inch, so I end up with something that looks like this. The side seams are pressed towards the back, and the front seam I will just pick a side, left or right, and press it that way. Then I will need to finish off the back edges with bias binding. You could of course overlock those, you could pink the edges. My personal preference is bias binding, so that's what I'm going to use. I've pressed the seams flat and they are now finished. I am finishing off the centre back edges with bias binding. So I've got the right side of the binding to the wrong side of the fabric. You can tell it's the wrong side because we've got the seam on the inside here, and I am stitching in the little crease here, lining up the raw edge of the binding with the raw edge of the back seam, and I'm going to stitch all the way down to the top there. I can then wrap the binding around and top stitch it down, which I'll show you in a second. So like I mentioned, I am now wrapping the bias binding around the raw edge and top stitching it down. I'm using my blind hem foot because it has this guide, and I've moved my needle all the way over to the left. I am meant to get a top stitching foot, which would mean that I could have all this fabric to the other side of the presser foot at the Festival of Quilts, but unfortunately they didn't have any stock with them, so I need to order one. But I am basically pushing the binding down with my left forefinger, and I am pushing the fabric flat with my right hand, and I'm sewing looking through the viewfinder, which is interesting. You may want to pin this. I don't ever pin this in place because I find that it distorts the fabric a little bit, but this is something that I've been doing for years now, so I've definitely kind of got like the feel for it. I'm gonna keep running this guide along the edge, and I'm nearly at the end. There's a stray thread there. Stitch, trim my threads, and then my binding looks like this. So this will get pressed, and then we can sew our peplum to our top. Believe it or not, that's a finished peplum. That's a finished top of a top. I am deviating from the pattern again. Step 18 has asked us to baste the pleat lines, lower and back opening edges. So basically basting all the way around. I am not going to finish mine like that. I have actually pressed up the raw edge of the lining by 5/8 of an inch, and I'm going to slip stitch that into place once the zip is in. So I'm not paying attention to the way that they're finishing this top. So the next step is 28. Pin peplum to lower edge of top, clipping peplum where necessary, baste, stitch in a double stitch seam, press seam towards peplum. Again, like I said, I'm not doing it this way because I want to finish mine slightly differently. I'm going to pin my peplum to my outer top only, leaving the lining free so that I can enclose the zipper tape. It again is just a personal preference of mine, so I'm going to get it pinned in place and show you what it looks like. I have pinned the peplum to the outer of the top, right sides together. I'm going to sew it with the top facing up so that I can control the pleats and make sure that nothing gets caught or tucked under, because the peplum is relatively smooth and there's nothing to ease or gather in to the stitching line. So I think it's going to work best if I try and make sure that this all lies nice and flatly. So I'm going to sew those together at 5/8 of an inch, then press the seam up towards the bodice. I have sewn the bodice to the peplum and I have pressed the seam up into the bodice. So I'm now going to attach the invisible zip. I have my invisible zipper foot on. I have moved my needle 2 strokes over to the left, so it's very close to the coils, and I'm just going to sew that at 5/8 of an inch. I won't go into any more detail about putting in invisible zips because loads of people have different methods. There is a really good method by Threads that I will link in the description down below for you. I'm going to get this side sewn in, mark the waist seam, and then sew the other side in. I have got my zip sewn in. I am now going to finish up the neck edge. If you remember, I left about 1 inch free so that I could put the zip in and then sandwich it between the outer and lining. So I'm going to get that sewn in and understitched. Then I can sew the lining centre back seam to the zipper tape and finish up the centre back seam of the peplum, and then we're nearly done. Okay, so I have sewn the last inch down, so I have enclosed the zip. The zip is in there, so I'm now going to finish off the understitching from here to this edge, and I'll do the same for the other side. Once I've done that, I can then enclose the zipper tape in the lining and get that sandwiched in place, and I'll show you how I do that when we get to it. I am finishing the edge of the bodice by putting the right sides together, and you'll notice here that I have the stitching for the neckline and the understitching rolled to the inside. This is the lining side. I have also offset the lining by about 1/8 of an inch, nearly 1/4 of an inch, because we're going to be sewing next to this line of stitching. This is securing the zipper tape in place. We don't want to stitch right where this is because then our zip won't work. We want to stitch close to it to finish off the edge and make sure that the zip pull can still easily slide up and down. So it's basically, we're sewing 1/4 of an inch here, so we need 1/4 of an inch hanging over the edge. We're going to sew from the waistline up to the top edge and back stitch, and we're going to do that with the regular zipper foot. Mine looks like this, and I'll be doing it with the needle not all the way over to the left, but just over to the left enough that it won't hit the bar in the middle of my foot. So I'm going to get that done for this side and then repeat on the other side. Okay, so I'm going to want to trim off this excess here, but I am going to turn the top through just to check that I'm happy with how everything's looking before I cut anything off. And yeah, that's going to be a nice neat finish. So I'm just going to trim off the excess and turn that through properly, and then we can sew the other side. So I want to get rid of all that excess there. So there's a little bit of zipper tape and a little bit of fabric. So we'll turn it through properly this time, and just pull on the zipper tape gently, kind of manipulate that top edge there, and that is a nice and neatly finished zip. So I'm going to do the same for the other side, and then we can close up the bottom edge of the peplum. I have the lining all sewn to the zipper tape. This hasn't been pressed yet, so I still don't need to go and press anything quite yet because I have to finish the back peplum seam. So I'm going to pin these together with the right sides together. I will keep my regular zipper foot on, and I'm not going to be able to get right up to this stitching, but I'm just going to overlap the stitching by a couple of millimeters, and I'll be a couple of millimeters out, and that will finish off the raw edge. Again, I'll have linked a zipper tutorial down below where you won't have to do this step. This is just the way that I do it. It's worked for me. I haven't tried the other way. I probably would like it, but this is way I know. It's quick, and I personally find it very easy to do. So it was one of those things that once you found a way that works for you, keep on doing it. So I'm going to sew this edge shut, and then I can press everything open. Then we can finish the raw edge, slip stitch the waistline, the waist seam together, and we will be done. Okay, so my back seam is sewn up and pressed. I have just sewn a line of stitching 1/4 of an inch away from the raw edge, and I'm going to use this as a pressing guide for the hem. So I'm going to press that up once and then again to enclose the raw edge and give me a nice crisp edge that I can then top stitch down to finish off the hem. I have sewn and pressed the hem. I have now pinned the lining to the waist seam, and I'm going to slip stitch that into place, and then we'll be done. Hopefully I like this top. If you have any questions at all, please let me know in the comments section down below, and I will do my best to answer them for you. This is a nice top. I don't think it's the right top for me. I don't think that this is going to get worn in my wardrobe. I think it will be donated the next time that I have a wardrobe cull, and I very much doubt that I would take it out to wear it again. How I've styled it today is how I would have worn it if I did ever wear it out in public. As I've mentioned, I have other tops that I think suit me better and I feel more confident in, so this is not something that I will probably reach for ever. I'm really glad that the Patreon peeps voted for this one. It was something outside of my comfort zone, so I'm glad I've tried it. I just now realise that grown on sleeves are not the one. So I hope you've enjoyed today's video. If you have, please give it a thumbs up. If you haven't yet, please subscribe, and I'll see you again very soon. Bye.